Snoop Dogg could feel the pressure in the air, thick and suffocating. The first officer's stance hadn't relaxed. If anything, he seemed more agitated now, like he was searching for a reason to escalate things. The second officer stood nearby, watching, his expression unreadable. The crowd on the sidewalk had grown, their voices hushed but restless. The glow of their phone screens flickered in the night, capturing every second. Snoop knew he had to handle this right. One wrong move, one wrong word, and this could spiral out of control. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't stupid either. He had seen how moments like this could turn deadly in an instant. He had seen how even the calmest situations could be twisted, how reality could be rewritten by whoever controlled the narrative. And right now, this officer wanted to be the one in control. The officer took another step forward, his hand still hovering near his holster. His eyes locked onto Snoop's, filled with something dark, something personal. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the night like a blade. Snoop didn't move right away. He had been in situations like this before. He knew hesitation could be dangerous, but so could moving too fast. His mind raced. Why was this happening? He had done nothing wrong. No law had been broken. So why was this officer pushing so hard? Was it about power? About making an example out of him? The crowd murmured. Someone called out, "He ain't do nothing, man." Another voice echoed, "We see you, officer." The tension snapped tighter. Snoop could see the officer's fingers twitch, his jaw clench. The energy had shifted, and now it wasn't just about him. It was about the eyes watching, the people filming, the ones who wouldn't let this moment disappear into silence. Snoop inhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "You got a reason for asking me to step out?" he asked, his hands still visible. "I gave you my license. I ain't got nothing to hide." The officer's eyes flashed, his stance shifting like he wasn't expecting Snoop to push back in that way. Not aggressively, but with confidence. "I said, step out of the car," the officer repeated, his voice tighter now. Snoop could feel his heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. He wasn't just Snoop Dogg, the rapper, the businessman, the icon. Right now, he was every person who had ever been pulled over and felt that invisible line between justice and something much darker. The second officer shifted slightly, his eyes flicking between Snoop and his partner. He could sense it too, the tension that was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. Snoop made his choice. He moved slowly, carefully, reaching for the door handle. He wasn't going to give them any reason to say he was resisting. But just as he began to push the door open, the officer flinched, stepping back slightly, his hand jerking toward his holster. The crowd gasped. A ripple of fear passed through the air. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. And then something unexpected happened. Something no one could have predicted. Something that changed everything. Just as Snoop Dogg pushed the door open, the officer's body tensed, his fingers twitching dangerously close to his holster. The crowd let out a collective gasp, the sound cutting through the night like a warning. In that split second, everything slowed down. Snoop could see it in the officer's eyes, that flicker of hesitation, that split moment where decisions were made that couldn't be undone. Then out of nowhere, a voice cut through the chaos. "Yo, hold up." It wasn't from the crowd. It wasn't from the second officer. It came from behind them, from someone neither Snoop nor the officer had noticed before. A man in plain clothes stepped forward, moving quickly but carefully. His face was partially shadowed by the streetlights, but there was something familiar about him. The first officer turned sharply, clearly irritated at the interruption. "Back up, this is a police matter," he barked, but the man kept coming. Then just as he stepped into the light, Snoop recognized him. It was someone from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years. The energy of the moment shifted in an instant. The officer's frustration turned to confusion. The second officer, who had been standing back and watching, straightened up, suddenly more alert. "Man, you don't even know who you're messing with," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "I suggest you think twice before you do something you can't take back." The first officer narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" It was supposed to be just another night, another drive, another moment in the life of one of the biggest names in hip-hop. But for Snoop Dogg, this wasn't just any night. This was the night he found himself staring down the barrel of a gun, held by a police officer whose intentions were far from just. The flashing red and blue lights reflected in his car's windows, cutting through the darkness, as a routine stop quickly turned into something much more dangerous. Snoop had dealt with his fair share of police encounters before. As a young black man growing up in Long Beach, he knew all too well what it meant to be unfairly targeted. But this time, something felt different. This officer wasn't just following protocol. There was something else behind his eyes. A kind of anger, a prejudice, a power trip that went beyond just enforcing the law. Snoop could feel it in the way the officer moved, in the way he spoke, in the way his hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. The air was thick with tension. A single wrong move, a misunderstood gesture, and things could have ended in tragedy. Snoop kept his hands where they could be seen, his mind racing through his options. Would this be the moment that changed everything? The moment where his name would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. He wasn't just a rapper. He was a father, a son, a cultural icon. And yet, in that moment, none of that seemed to matter. To this officer, he was just another suspect, another target. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Bystanders in the distance had their phones out, recording, knowing all too well how these situations often played out. The tension was undeniable. The fear was real. But what happened next? That's where the story takes a turn no one saw coming. Snoop wasn't about to let this moment define him. He wasn't about to become another statistic. What he did next left everyone, fans, critics, and even the officer himself, completely shocked. This wasn't just about survival. This was about something bigger, and the way Snoop handled the situation. Well, it's something that people still talk about to this day. Stay tuned because you won't believe what happened next. Snoop Dogg sat still, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. Years in the music industry, years of navigating both success and struggle, had taught him one thing: how to read a situation. And right now, he could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound chain. The officer's hand was still on his gun, his stance stiff. His eyes locked onto Snoop, like he was waiting for an excuse. Any excuse. Snoop knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, one misinterpreted action, and this could spiral out of control. His hands remained where they could be seen, his breathing slow and measured. He had been through enough in life to recognize when things weren't about justice, but about power. And right now, this officer was flexing his. But why? Snoop wasn't speeding. He wasn't swerving. He wasn't breaking any laws. So why was he here, sitting in this moment that felt like a trap? Was it because of who he was? Because of the color of his skin? Because of his fame? Or was it all of those things mixed together? Whatever the reason, it didn't matter now. He had to think fast. The officer took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the pavement. His voice was sharp, almost daring Snoop to push back. License and registration, he demanded, but there was something in his tone, something more than just authority. Snoop nodded, moving slow, deliberate. "It's in the glove compartment," he said, making sure every word was clear. He didn't want any misunderstandings. The officer didn't respond, just watched. His fingers flexed over his holster. The moment dragged on, thick with unspoken tension. Snoop knew what could happen next. He had seen it play out before, on the news, in stories from friends, in his own experiences growing up. He thought about his family, his kids, his fans, the people who looked up to him. He wasn't about to let this go the way so many other situations had. He had too much to lose. So he did what he knew best. He used his words. "Officer," he said, his voice steady but calm. "I got no problem with you, man. I'm just trying to get home. You see me, you know who I am. I ain't out here looking for trouble." The officer's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Was it recognition? Hesitation? Or just a moment of reconsideration? Whatever it was brief. Snoop slowly reached toward the glove compartment, careful, controlled. Every movement was intentional, because he knew this moment could go bad in the blink of an eye. His fingers found the leather wallet that held his license, and as he pulled it out, the officer's grip on his weapon didn't relax. The street was quiet. The flashing lights bathed the area in an eerie glow. A couple of onlookers whispered to each other, their phones held up, recording. They had seen enough in their lifetime to know that moments like this didn't always end well. Snoop handed over his license, keeping his eyes on the officer. He could feel the energy in the air, the silent battle between perception and reality. The officer looked down at the ID, then back at Snoop. The seconds stretched. Something was off. Then the officer leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You think your name means something out here?" he asked, his voice dripping with something Snoop couldn't quite place. Was it resentment? Jealousy? Spite? Snoop didn't answer right away. He had seen this before. He had dealt with this before. Some people weren't just out to do their job. Some people wanted to prove a point. And Snoop could tell. This officer wasn't just pulling him over for a routine stop. This was personal. But why? And what happened next? Well, that's where things took a turn no one expected. Snoop Dogg held the officer's stare, his mind working fast. The way the officer spoke, the way he looked at him, it was clear this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It wasn't even about enforcing the law. This was something deeper, something personal, and Snoop could feel it in his bones. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. The officer still had his hand near his weapon, his eyes scanning Snoop's face, like he was searching for a reason, any reason, to escalate the situation. Snoop had been in intense moments before, on stage, in boardrooms, even in the streets back in the day. But this was different. This was the kind of situation where one wrong word, one wrong move, could change everything. "You think your name means something out here?" The officer repeated, his voice cold, his grip tightening slightly on his belt. Snoop didn't answer right away. He knew better than to feed into whatever game this officer was playing. Instead, he stayed calm, measured. "I ain't looking for no trouble," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm just trying to get home." The officer smirked, shaking his head slightly. "Yeah, home to what? Your fancy house. Your $1 million lifestyle." He paused, glancing at Snoop's car like it was proof of something. "You think that makes you different?" Snoop felt something shift in the air. This wasn't about the stop anymore. It was about power, about control. This officer wasn't looking for a reason. He was making one. From the corner of his eye, Snoop noticed more people gathering on the sidewalk, watching. Phones were out, cameras rolling. The world was watching, and that meant the stakes were even higher. If this went sideways, it wouldn't just be another traffic stop gone wrong. It would be a headline, a viral moment. But for Snoop, this wasn't about publicity. It was about survival. Another officer arrived, walking up to the scene with a more neutral expression. He glanced at Snoop, then at the first officer. "Everything good here?" he asked, his voice steady. The first officer didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened, like he didn't want to let go of whatever power he thought he had. Snoop could see the shift. The new officer's presence was forcing him to rethink his approach. "Just running a check," the first officer finally muttered, stepping back slightly. But the look in his eyes said something else. This wasn't over. Snoop exhaled slowly, but he wasn't relieved yet. He knew how these things worked. A situation could cool off in an instant, then explode just as quickly. The second officer looked at Snoop. "You got everything you need." Snoop nodded, but before he could speak, the first officer cut in. "We're not done here." His voice was sharp, his stance tense. It was clear he didn't like being questioned. Not by Snoop, not by anyone. And that's when Snoop realized something. This wasn't about him personally. This officer wasn't just targeting Snoop because of who he was. He was targeting him because of what he represented. Success, influence, power outside of the system. Snoop had seen it before. Some people couldn't stand to see someone like him rise above the limits they thought were set in stone. They wanted to remind him that no matter how big he got, they could still pull him over, still put him in check. But what the officer didn't understand was that Snoop had already won this battle in ways that couldn't be measured in words. He wasn't just another rapper. He was a movement. And no badge, no weapon, no intimidation could change that. Still, this wasn't over. The officer wasn't backing down. And Snoop knew he had one shot to turn this moment in his favor before it became something else entirely. What happened next? That's where everything took an unexpected turn. Snoop sat there for a long moment, the note still in his hand. The traffic stop was over. The officers were gone. But something told him this was just the beginning. Snoop Dogg sat there for a moment, the paper still in his hands, his mind racing. The flashing lights were gone, the crowd had started to thin out, and the tension in the air was beginning to fade. But something inside him told him this wasn't really over. Not even close. He looked down at the words again. Asterisk, this isn't over, asterisk. It was simple, but it carried weight. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. A reminder that, no matter how far he had come, there were still people out there who wanted to see him fall. People who didn't like the idea of someone like him having power, having influence. Snoop exhaled slowly, folding the note and slipping it into his pocket. He wasn't going to let fear control him. He had been through too much, built too much, to let something like this shake him. If anything, it just made him more certain of one thing. He had to keep moving forward. Keep winning. That was the best way to respond to people who wanted to see him lose. Carter was gone now, but his words still echoed in Snoop's mind. Asterisk, be careful. This goes deeper than you think, asterisk. He didn't know exactly what that meant, but he had a feeling he was going to find out sooner or later. As he started his car, the low hum of the engine filled the quiet street. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the officers watching from a distance, but there was nothing, just the empty road behind him. He pulled away from the curb, his hands steady on the wheel, but his thoughts still turning. What had really happened that night? Was it just about one officer with a personal grudge, or was it something bigger? Carter seemed to think so. And if a federal agent was involved, that meant there were layers to this he hadn't even begun to uncover. But Snoop wasn't the type to sit around and wait for answers to come to him. He had built his life by staying ahead, by staying sharp, by making sure he was always the one in control. As he drove through the quiet streets, the city lights flickering in the distance, He made a decision. He wasn't going to let this shake him, but he also wasn't going to ignore it. If they wanted him to feel something that night, they failed. Because all he felt now was motivation. By the time he reached his home, the tension had settled, but the fire inside him hadn't dimmed. He stepped out of his car, taking in the calm of the night, the silence that surrounded his property. This was his life, his success, his story, and no one was going to take that from him. He pulled the note out of his pocket one last time, reading the words again. Asterisk, this isn't over, asterisk. He smirked slightly, shaking his head as he folded it up once more. We'll see about that, he muttered under his breath. Then he walked inside, closing the door behind him, leaving the night, and whatever was coming next, right where it belonged.